3 years. That is how long a border county sheriff's department functioned as a paid protection service for a fentanyl distribution corridor that moved an estimated 1,900 kilograms of narcotics into the American interior. Not a corrupt deputy, not a single officer on a cartel payroll. The sheriff himself, the elected law enforcement authority of a county sitting directly on a primary overland drug transit route, had been recruited, compensated, and operationally directed by a foreign intelligence network with connections to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The payments did not come in cash envelopes. They came through a series of financial instruments sophisticated enough that it took a joint DEA, FBI, and Treasury Department task force 14 months to fully reconstruct the money trail. And while that money moved, so did the drugs. 1,900 kilograms of fentanyl and fentanyl precursor compounds. Projected casualties from the product that reached street distribution: between 460 and 620 deaths across 11 states. The sheriff was still attending community events, still giving press statements about his department's commitment to border security, still shaking hands at county fairs when DEA Hunter closed the case around him. This is DEA Hunter. The first indication that something was structurally wrong with law enforcement operations in the county came not from an informant, not from surveillance, and not from financial intelligence. It came from a map. ADE, a regional intelligence analyst working a cross-border fentanyl flow assessment, noticed that a specific overland corridor, a network of secondary and tertiary roads running through a remote border county, showed almost no law enforcement interdiction activity over a 34-month period, despite being identified in cartel logistics intelligence as an active transit route. Adjacent corridors, by contrast, showed consistent interdiction attempts, arrests, and seizures. The disparity was striking enough that the analyst flagged it in a regional threat assessment, noting that the absence of interdiction activity in an identified active corridor could reflect operational capacity limitations, geographic access challenges, or, flagged as a possibility requiring further evaluation, deliberate non-enforcement. Geographic access challenges were real in this corridor. The county was sparsely populated, with a sheriff's department operating on a limited budget and covering a large land area. Operational capacity limitations were a plausible explanation. The analyst noted this. She also noted that in the same 34-month period, the corridor had generated 0 tips, 0 traffic stops resulting in drug findings, and 0 interdiction referrals from the county to state or federal partners, a statistical profile that, in an active transit corridor, was unusual regardless of resource constraints. The assessment was reviewed by a supervisory special agent in DEA's Border Enforcement Division. He added one additional data point from a source he had developed over several years working the border region, a confidential informant with mid-level visibility into cartel logistics. Planning had mentioned in an unrelated debrief session that a specific county along the overland route was considered clean passage by the cartel's transportation coordinators. Clean passage, in the informant's framing, meant a route segment where law enforcement contact was not anticipated. The informant did not know why. He knew only that the designation existed and that it affected how the cartel planned load movements through the region. Those 2 data points, the analyst's map anomaly and the informant's clean passage reference, did not constitute a predicate for an investigation of the sheriff's department. They constituted a question that needed more development before any formal action could be considered. The supervisory agent opened a preliminary inquiry under tight compartmentalization and began building toward a predicate. What emerged over the following 6 weeks changed the inquiry into a full investigation. Financial intelligence development, using legal process carefully designed to avoid triggering awareness in any local or state law enforcement structure, identified unusual financial activity associated with the sheriff's personal accounts. The activity was not dramatic in isolation. It showed a pattern of deposits over a 30-month period that in total amounted to approximately $940,000 above his documented government salary, investment returns, and identified personal income sources. The deposits were structured, broken into amounts that individually fell below reporting thresholds, made at irregular intervals, Routed through a combination of personal accounts and a small property management company the sheriff had established 2 years before the financial anomaly period began. The property management company was the thread. It had no documented tenants, no documented properties under active management, and no documented revenue sources beyond the deposits that appeared to originate from financial instruments connected to a web of shell entities incorporated in jurisdictions outside the United States. Tracing those shell entities, work performed by Treasury Department financial intelligence specialists who joined the task force in its third month, led to a structure that, when fully mapped, connected to financial infrastructure associated with foreign nationals with documented ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This finding elevated the investigation immediately and substantially. What had begun as a potential law enforcement corruption inquiry involving a cartel transit corridor had become something considerably more complex. Evidence suggesting that a foreign state-linked intelligence and paramilitary organization had recruited and was operationally directing a sitting American county sheriff. The case was briefed upward to senior federal law enforcement and intelligence oversight leadership. Coordination with the intelligence community was established under protocols that maintained strict separation between law enforcement, evidentiary development, and intelligence equities. The IRGC connection required careful analytical assessment. The IRGC's documented involvement in narcotics trafficking is not a novel finding. It has been the subject of Treasury Department sanctions actions and federal prosecutions involving IRGC-linked individuals using drug revenue to finance operational activities. The specific mechanism identified in this investigation, the use of a foreign intelligence-recruited domestic law enforcement official to protect a narcotics transit corridor, represented a particularly sophisticated operational architecture. It combined the cartel's logistics infrastructure, which controlled the actual product movement, with a foreign intelligence protection layer that operated at a remove from the cartel's direct organizational structure. The arrangement, as investigators would eventually reconstruct it from financial records, digital evidence, and cooperative source testimony, worked as follows. A cartel-affiliated logistics network held the transit corridor and moved product through it. The IRGC-linked network, operating through intermediaries who had no direct contact with the cartel, had established a separate commercial relationship with the sheriff, framed entirely in non-narcotics terms, structured as payments for unspecified security consulting and regional intelligence services provided through his property management entity. The sheriff, according to the evidence picture that emerged, understood that his compensation was connected to maintaining the corridor's clean passage status. He did not need to know the specific operational details of what moved through it or who was moving it. His role was simpler. Ensure that his department did not generate the enforcement activity that would disrupt the corridor, and ensure that federal and state partners operating in the region did not receive intelligence support or operational facilitation that might lead them into the corridor independently. That second function, active interference with external enforcement operations, was documented in the investigation's evidence record and represented the most serious operational dimension of the corruption. On at least 7 occasions over the 3-year period, the sheriff or senior members of his department had received notification of planned DEA or Border Patrol operations in or near the county, and had failed to provide information or coordination support that their role as local law enforcement would normally have generated. In 3 of those 7 instances, the evidence suggested more active interference, a failure to provide a surveillance position that DEA had requested, a delay in processing a search warrant referral that resulted in a target vehicle leaving the before the warrant could be executed, and an incident in which a cartel-connected vehicle was stopped by a deputy, found to contain anomalous cargo weight indicators, and released without further inspection following a direct call from the sheriff to the deputy on scene. That third incident, the stopped vehicle released on a direct call, was documented in the deputy's own contemporaneous notes, which he had maintained as a personal record after the incident made him uncomfortable. The deputy had not reported the incident through official channels. He had written it down, dated it, and kept it. When investigators eventually reached him through a carefully managed outreach process, he provided the notes voluntarily. He had known something was wrong. He had not known what to do about it. His notes became one of the central evidentiary items in the prosecution case. The vehicle that had been released, investigators subsequently determined, had been carrying approximately 80 kilograms of fentanyl in a concealed load compartment. The vehicle's subsequent movement, traced through cell tower data and subsequent cartel logistics intelligence, placed it at a staging facility in a city 400 miles north of the county 2 days after the traffic stop. The 80 kilograms entered the distribution network from that facility. The downstream casualty projection for that single load, based on the supply chain's documented fentanyl purity and the distribution network's geographic footprint, was between 34 and 52 overdose deaths. 34 to 52 deaths from a single vehicle released at a traffic stop by a deputy who received a phone call from his sheriff. The full 3-year accounting was proportionally larger. 1,900 kilograms of fentanyl and fentanyl precursor compounds moved through the corridor during the period the investigation covered. Not all of it was pure fentanyl. A portion consisted of fentanyl analogs and precursor chemicals that would be processed into finished product downstream. The finished product yield from the precursor component, estimated by DEA forensic chemistry analysts, placed the total effective fentanyl equivalent of the corridor's 3-year output at approximately 1,400 to 1,600 kilograms. At the supply chain's documented purity levels and the distribution network's geographic scope across 11 states, DEA healthcare analysts projected between 460 and 620 deaths attributable to product that had passed through the corridor during the protection period. 460 to 620 deaths protected by $940,000 in payments routed through a property management company with no tenants. The IRGC-linked financial network had invested less than 1.5% of the estimated street value of the corridor's 3-year output in securing the protection arrangement. The return on that investment, in terms of narcotics revenue protected from interdiction, in terms of the cartel's logistics security in a high-value transit corridor, in terms of the operational intelligence value of maintaining a law enforcement asset at the county level, was substantial by any financial analysis. The IRGC-linked network was not in the narcotics business for ideological reasons. It was in the narcotics business because narcotics revenue finances operational activities that have nothing to do with drugs. The corridor's product was a revenue stream. The sheriff was an infrastructure cost. 14 months into the investigation, the evidentiary picture had reached the threshold where federal prosecutors in a non-adjacent district reviewed the case and determined that it supported prosecution. The financial reconstruction was complete. The deputy's contemporaneous notes were secured. 2 cooperative sources, one a financial operative who had processed payments within the shell entity structure, one a cartel-adjacent logistics figure who had knowledge of the clean passage arrangement from the transportation planning side, had provided testimony corroborated through independent evidence. Digital forensics conducted through legal process on devices associated with the shell entity structure had produced communications that, while encrypted, had been partially decrypted and showed coordination between payment processors and individuals in the foreign financial network. The arrest operation was designed with the same compartmentalization discipline that had governed the entire investigation. The sheriff had access to state and local law enforcement communication systems. Any alert within those systems in the days before the operation could create a flight risk or evidence destruction scenario. The federal arrest team was assembled entirely from personnel with no prior operational contact with the county. The warrants, arrest, search, and financial restraint orders covering the property management company's accounts and the personal accounts connected to the deposit pattern were processed through federal court in a district geographically removed from the county. At 5:52 in the morning, the arrest team reached the sheriff's residence. He was taken into custody as he answered the door. At the same moment, search teams executed warrants at his office in the county courthouse, at a storage facility associated with the property management company, and at a residence associated with one of the domestic financial intermediaries in the payment chain. Digital devices, phones, tablets, a personal laptop, a desktop computer at the property management company's registered address were secured before the sheriff had any opportunity to communicate with external contacts. The search of the storage facility produced a physical item that had not been anticipated in the warrant inventory: a ledger. handwritten in a format consistent with personal record-keeping rather than official documentation. The ledger contained dated entries that corresponded, in a review conducted by financial analysts over the following 72 hours, to the payment deposits in the sheriff's financial accounts, with a high degree of correlation. The entries did not name the source of the payments. They used reference codes, but the dates, the amounts, and the entry format provided corroborating documentation of the financial pattern the investigation had already established through banking records. Why the sheriff had maintained a personal record of payments he was receiving for corrupt services was not immediately clear. The most straightforward explanation, offered by a forensic behavioral analyst reviewing the evidence, was that it reflected an attempt to maintain a private accounting of what he was owed, a record kept for his own reference in a situation where he could not trust the payment structure to be accurate without independent verification. It was, in that interpretation, a document produced by distrust between co-conspirators. Whatever the reason for its existence, its evidentiary value was significant. The simultaneous financial restraint orders froze approximately $1.2 million across the accounts connected to the corruption architecture, the property management company account, the personal accounts showing the deposit pattern, and 2 intermediary accounts identified in the financial reconstruction. The foreign shell entity accounts, located in offshore jurisdictions, were referred to Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control and to international financial enforcement partners under applicable legal frameworks. Recovery of those assets is a separate and ongoing process. In the law enforcement aftermath of the arrest, DEA and Border Patrol moved quickly to establish active surveillance and interdiction coverage in the corridor that had operated as clean passage for 3 years. Within the first 60 days following the sheriff's arrest, 3 separate interdiction operations in the corridor produced seizures totaling approximately 240 kilograms of fentanyl and methamphetamine from vehicles using transit routes that the investigation had identified as primary corridor arteries. The cartel's transportation coordinators had not yet fully adjusted their routing in response to the loss of the protection arrangement. The 60-day window produced more corridor seizures than the preceding 34 months combined. The contrast was stark enough that it appeared in DEA's internal operational assessment as a quantitative measure of what the protection arrangement had cost. 34 months of near-zero interdiction, 60 days of active enforcement, 240 kilograms seized, 11 arrests, 3 vehicles with concealed compartments confirmed as active load vehicles. The corridor had not been quiet because the cartel wasn't using it. It had been quiet because a county sheriff with $940,000 in his property management company's account had made sure that nobody looked. The deputy, whose contemporaneous notes had become a central evidentiary item in the case, was placed in a witness protection protocol following the arrest. The cartel's awareness of his role as a source could not be fully assessed, and the precautionary placement was considered necessary. His department career was managed through a separate administrative process that maintained his employment status while the legal proceedings developed. The cooperative sources who had provided testimony in the investigation were managed under security arrangements that remained active at the time the investigation closed. The IRGC-linked financial network's domestic operational elements had been disrupted by the arrests and financial restraint orders, but the network's foreign principals remained outside U.S. jurisdiction. Their identification was complete. Coordination with intelligence community partners and international law enforcement regarding those principles was ongoing. The 11 states across which product from the corridor had been distributed over the 3-year protection period each had their own downstream enforcement picture, their own overdose statistics, their own distribution network mapping, their own active investigations that had been proceeding without knowledge of the protection arrangement upstream in the supply chain. Some of those investigations had been generating arrests and seizures of distributors who were handling product that had passed through the corridor. Those investigations continued. The disruption of the corridor's protection arrangement did not retroactively resolve those downstream networks, but it cut the supply pipeline that had been feeding them. The projected 460 to 620 deaths attributable to product that moved through the corridor during the protection period is a range, not a precise count. The methodology behind it, forensic chemistry analysis of seized samples from the supply chain, distribution network mapping, regional overdose mortality data, healthcare system analysis, produces estimates, not certainties. Some of the deaths in that range are reflected in specific case files. Others are in regional overdose statistics where the supply chain attribution is probable but not individually confirmed. The range is the honest accounting of what the evidence supports. What the evidence supports without a range is this. A foreign intelligence network linked to the IRGC identified a domestic law enforcement vulnerability, recruited an elected official to exploit it, paid for 3 years of corridor protection with money routed through layers of financial obfuscation, and generated returns on that investment, measured in narcotics revenue, protected from interdiction, while communities across 11 states absorbed the human cost in overdose wards and medical examiner offices. DEA hunter cases do not always begin with a drug seizure or a surveillance operation. Sometimes they begin with a map that shows the absence of something that should be there. Sometimes the most important data point is the enforcement activity that is not happening in a place where the intelligence says it should be. The analyst, who noticed that the corridor showed near zero interdiction activity in 34 months, spent 2 days building the anomaly assessment before she flagged it. She was not working a corruption case. She was working a regional fentanyl flow assessment. The corruption was not what she was looking for. It was what the data showed her when she looked at the right numbers. That is the margin. 2 days of analysis on a map anomaly. 14 months of careful investigation that followed. The deputy's handwritten notes kept in a personal file because something felt wrong and he did not know what else to do. A financial operative who decided that cooperation was in his interest. A ledger in a storage unit that should never have existed. Think about the county. Think about the community events and the press statements and the handshakes at the county fair and what was happening on the secondary roads while the sheriff smiled for the cameras. Think about what clean passage means, not as a cartel logistics term, but as a description of what 3 years of paid protection looks like from the perspective of the families in 11 states who got the phone calls. Think about the map that started this. The absence of something that should have been there. Drop a comment. Which element of this case, the IRGC financial network, the deputy's personal notes, the ledger in the storage unit, or the 60-day enforcement surge after the arrest, represents the most significant turning point in how this operation unraveled? We read every response. If this reached you, share it. Because clean passage has a cost and it is never paid by the people who arrange it. DEA hunter. Because sometimes the corruption is wearing the badge with the county seal.